Yeah, contacts is certainly true that I got to meet Capra, for example, through Variety, and then I got to work with him through the American Film Institute program, and so it gave me a sort of an entree into his life. And yeah, I met a lot of other people on Variety that I wouldn't have met otherwise, and then also I wrote for film magazines, and a lot of it was just sort of self-generated. I would call up some director like Howard Hawks and say, could I interview you for a film magazine? And he said, sure. And so I spent like 7 years off and on talking to Hawks, and came out with a book called Hawks on Hawks, an interview book with him. So being in Hollywood, being on the scene, and being a reporter did give me a lot of contacts and inside knowledge. And but I've always combined that with a kind of academic approach as well, because I started out as a film scholar and student, and so I think I've managed to combine sort of popular approach and academic approach in my books, that they work on two levels, and they also are scholarly, but also deal a lot with the business of filmmaking, and so they're not. I like to transcend easy categorization. I like to do things that are in different categories. And biographies, I think, are a rich field, because what I've done in all three of my books, I've written them as critical studies as well as biographies. There's a term called critical biographies, which these fit, which means you write about the work as well as the man. And in all three cases, I felt each of these directors was not fully understood as an artist, because if you don't really understand the life, sometimes people get confused about the art. For example, people had many confused ideas about Capra's actual politics, so they had trouble interpreting what he was saying in the films. And if you just work on the films without knowing anything about the man, you can get very confused as well. So I think that the two go hand in hand. If you understand the man and the work, both, they kind of illuminate each other. With the Ford book, I felt what was missing in Ford scholarship was where did these films come from in this strange man who wouldn't explain his work. He was very gruff and hard to interview, and I interviewed him. He was extremely difficult to interview. He hardly would say anything straight to me. He was kind of being difficult and putting me on and pretending not to remember his own films. And at the time, I found that very frustrating. But since then, I've come to respect that, because he basically was acting like, I want you to just look at my films and make up your own mind. I'm not going to tell you what to think of the films. And today, when directors make films, they always, give a lot of interviews and tell you what to think. But Ford wouldn't do that at all, and I think that's kind of wonderful in a way. But so what that meant was people had a hard time understanding how this gruff, rough and tough character, who seemed not very intellectual or whatever, was capable of making these very subtle and beautiful and complicated films. And actually, his gruffness and anti-intellectualism was opposed. He was really a very well-read, self-taught person who was very sensitive. So nobody had ever kind of linked his inner life and his work clearly until I did my book. That was my goal in my book, and I think I did that.
So would you say you had the experience that most people wouldn't have, to actually talk to these great filmmakers? And does that, obviously you have seen their films before you interview them, but after you talk to them, does that really change your perspective on what they did and how they...
Well, I was very lucky that I came along at the time I did, because I was a young guy in the 60s, and then I went out to Hollywood and started interviewing people, and most of the great old American filmmakers were still around. And also I got to know a lot of great foreign filmmakers, like I knew Jean Renoir very well, and I knew Francois Truffaut and people like that. And I got to meet other directors from other countries, but a lot of the silent filmmakers were still alive, and people from the golden age of Hollywood, and then the actors, and most of those people are all gone now. And so a young person starting today would only be able to read about them. But I was fortunate enough to be there and really be trying to meet all the people I wanted to meet. and I was in a position where I could get to them, almost everybody I wanted to meet. I was very lucky. But I worked hard at it, and I really wanted to search out the people I knew I was interested in. But one reason they were willing to talk to me was that I did know their work. I had studied their work a lot before I would go see them, because that flatters people. They like to talk to some young person who knows their work. And if I hadn't known it, I wouldn't have gotten very far with those guys. And but certainly, I kept doing the research, because like when I started researching Ford, a lot of his, say, silent films were missing, and we've discovered a lot of them over the years. So I keep seeing new films by Ford. There's one that came out recently that was rediscovered called Upstream, which I still haven't managed to see yet. So here's a Ford film that I haven't caught up with, after all these years. So you keep studying these people, and then the more you study them, the more you get out of the films, and it does help to know them. Although, as I say with Ford, what was more interesting to me was his sort of body language and his personality that I picked up from sitting with him for an hour, because it wasn't what he said so much, it was kind of his manner and his defensiveness and his crankiness, and I learned a lot about him that I wouldn't have known if I hadn't spent that hour with him. But with Wells and Capra, I got a chance to sit and ask them all kinds of questions, and that helped a lot. But you can't rely too much on the person. There's a saying by D.H. Lawrence. He said, "Never trust the teller, trust the tale." So there's a fallacy if you expect that the artist will give you all the answers, because artists don't always understand their work completely anyway. They work out of their subconscious, and so it's part of our job as scholars and critics to interpret these works. And sometimes the artist doesn't know what his film is actually saying. That can happen.